At 8:33 on a Sunday morning in January 1996, the phone rang at the small police detachment in Vanderhoof, British Columbia. The man on the line didn't give his name, and he didn't stay on long. In roughly 10 seconds, he said the one thing he'd called to say. A family was buried at the south end of a ranch. He named the family, and he may have named the ranch too, but that part of the message was muffled past certainty. Then just like that, the line went dead. The family he mentioned had been missing at that point for 6.5 years. There was a father, a mother, and 2 little boys, all of who'd climbed into a stranger's pickup truck in the middle of a summer night and ridden west out of Prince George. It was the first time in all those years that anyone had claimed to know where they lay. Police traced that call, and the answer turned out to be its own small nightmare. To understand why, we have to go back to the 1st of August, 1989. That summer, Ronnie and Doreen Jack were renting a house at 2116 Strathcona Avenue in Prince George, the largest city in northern British Columbia. They were both 26, born a few weeks apart in the spring of 1963. They were members of the Chislata Carrier Nation, with roots in the country around Burns Lake, a few hours west along Highway 16. Like a lot of families from the smaller communities out that way, they'd come to Prince George looking for work. Prince George in 1989 was a forestry town to its bones, a city of roughly 70,000 people ringed by pulp mills and sawmills sitting where Highway 97 crosses Highway 16. The economy ran on trees, and short-term camp work that appeared and disappeared with the season was simply a fact of life there. A job offer from a stranger wasn't any reason for alarm, since that's just how jobs were distributed in the region in the 80s. Work was the problem, and Ronnie had made his living cutting wood, but a back injury had cost him his sawmill job, and by 1989 the family was getting by on government assistance. Money was desperately tight, and their circumstances were rough to say the least. Doreen had grown up harder than most people can imagine. As a child, she'd been sent to the Lejack Residential School near Fraser Lake in British Columbia, and she'd become a mother at 16 when Russell was born. Ronnie wasn't Russell's biological father, but he raised Russell as his own son and never treated him as anything else. Accounts of that last year describe a family in deep financial trouble. By one account given years later, Doreen once resorted to stealing cough medicine for the boys because there was no money to pay for it. Ronnie, meanwhile, had reportedly mentioned owing money to somebody, though he never said who. By that August, Russell was 9, a boy about to start another school year. His little brother Ryan had just turned 4, and his birthday fell in the last week of July, days before everything happened. Doreen's younger sister Marlene would later describe Doreen as the one who held everyone together, the sister who looked after the whole family. Whatever else was going wrong in their lives, the 4 of them were a unit. And then, just like that, a stranger offered to fix everything. On the evening of Tuesday, August 1st, 1989, Ronnie was at the First Leader, a pub about 4 blocks from the house on Strathcona. At some point, a man he didn't know struck up a conversation, and the conversation turned into a job offer. The pitch went like this. There was a logging camp out near Klukul's Lake, roughly 40 kilometers west of the city along Highway 16. The camp needed workers for 10 days to 2 weeks, and Ronnie could buck logs. That meant Ronnie wouldn't actually be out felling trees or removing branches, but rather cutting the semi-processed trees into even lengths. But the job offer got sweeter, since Doreen could work as a cook's helper in the camp as well. Best of all, there was supposedly daycare at the camp, so the boys could simply come along. For a laid-off woodcutter with a bad back and a negative bank account, it must have sounded like a lifeline. Nothing about it would have struck Ronnie as obviously wrong either, and nothing about the offers should have raised any red flags. Seasonal bushwork was how plenty of families in that part of Canada got by, and cutting wood was the trade he already knew. It wasn't uncommon for the men to bring their families along and for wives and girlfriends to find work in the camp as well. It also wasn't uncommon for these sort of jobs to be given out in the informal way that the man offered it to Ronnie. If the man wanted his offer to sound routine, he'd found exactly the right listener in Ronnie, precisely because he didn't make the offer too good to be true. Witnesses later described the unknown man in remarkable detail, and that description is nearly everything we have of him. He was white, somewhere between 35 and 40, and so physically enormous you're going to wonder how he's gone under the radar for decades. He was somewhere around 6'6", weighing anywhere from 200 to 275 pounds. He had reddish-brown hair and a full beard, wore a ball cap, and had a worn-out-looking red checkered lumberjack shirt. He also wore faded jeans, a blue nylon jacket, and work boots with leather fringes, and drove a dark-colored four-wheel drive pickup. In essence, the unknown man was essentially straight out of central casting as a burly Canadian lumberjack. There's no indication that anyone at the pub had ever seen him before, since he's the sort of person people would remember. There's also no indication that anyone who saw him that night ever saw him again, which makes things even more sinister. Late that evening, Ronnie left the pub with the man, who drove him the 4 blocks home, and then the phone calls started. Ronnie first called his brother in the Burns Lake area, reportedly to ask whether he could take the boys for a couple of weeks. The arrangement didn't work out, but with daycare promised at the camp, it didn't need to. So Russell and Ryan would come along. At 1:21 in the morning, now August 2nd, Ronnie called his mother, Mabel. That timestamp, preserved in the case file, marks the last contact anyone in the family ever had with them. He told her about the job, that they'd be gone 10 days to 2 weeks, and that they'd be back before school started. And then, reportedly, he added something that has haunted his family for nearly 4 decades. He told her that if they weren't back by then, that she should come looking for them. 2 of Doreen's relatives watched the family pack their things into the stranger's truck in the dark. What they saw was almost unbearably ordinary in lumber country, a family loading its bags in the middle of the night, off to chase 2 weeks of work. Sometime deep in the night, the pickup pulled away from Strathcona Avenue and headed west, and after that, no confirmed trace of Ronnie, Doreen, Russell, or Ryan Jack has ever been found. There was a cruel mechanism built into the arrangement because nobody was supposed to worry. The whole arrangement meant the family would be unreachable for 2 weeks, off in the bush at a remote camp with no phone line. Their silence wasn't a warning sign because, as it turns out, it appears that it was the plan all along. So 2 weeks passed, with no word, and then a third passed as well. The date Ronnie had promised, home before school started, came and went with no word. Late that August, on or around the 25th, Mabel Jack reported the 4 of them missing. Inside the house on Strathcona Avenue, the furniture and clothing were still in place, and the boys' school records were sitting where they'd been left. The Jacks had packed for 2 weeks, very clearly not for a new life, and whatever they'd walked into, they'd fully intended to walk back out of it when the time was up. The 3-week delay was damaging enough on its own, as the memories at the pub had already softened, and any physical trail was long cold. But then the file itself went sideways, in a way that's extremely difficult to explain. On September 7th, 1989, the case was reportedly marked as resolved by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The family was supposedly located, and the investigation was closed, but it wasn't true, and how the error happened has never been publicly explained. For the relatives waiting in Burns Lake, that meant weeks in which nobody official was looking for them at all. The family has said for decades that the early response was slow and reluctant, and that they believed being a First Nations family had everything to do with it. And as I'm editing, I realized I used a word that non-Canadians may not be familiar with. First Nations is a term used for Native Canadians here. Marlene has described being brushed off in those early years, left with the sense that a missing Indigenous family simply didn't rank highly for the Mounties. And having covered a number of these cases, and being Canadian myself, I can't say I disagree with this assessment at all. The geography also makes that suspicion extremely hard to dismiss, and my Canadian viewers may already know why. Prince George anchors the eastern end of the stretch of Highway 16, now known as the Highway of Tears. This is the highway where dozens of Indigenous women and girls have vanished from over the last number of decades. The Jack family drove west into that corridor and never came out, and their case is now remembered as part of that larger pattern. When investigators finally went looking, delayed by the original error, the first thing they couldn't find was the job itself. As far as anyone has ever been able to determine, there was no logging camp near Klukul's Lake hiring a family on those terms that summer. No employer ever stepped forward to say the Jacks had worked for them. The man in the red checkered shirt, a physically unmistakable giant who'd sat in a public bar making job offers, was never identified despite how jarring his appearance was. Investigators considered the simplest explanation early on, that the whole disappearance may have been the result of a motor vehicle accident. A pickup that goes off one of the thousands of logging roads west of Prince George can sit hidden under the timber or underwater for a very long time. No trace of the truck ever surfaced along any route the family might have taken, and over the decades since, several sites have been searched as possible locations. Every one of them came up empty, but the problem is, this doesn't necessarily disprove the theory at all. In the 125-mile radius around Prince George, the exact amount of logging roads, including abandoned logging roads, is unknown. I don't have the data from 1989, but an estimate by the government of British Columbia as of 2026 indicates there are up to 25,000 miles of road within that radius. Expand the radius out to 200 miles, and that figure continues to balloon outward, showing how difficult it would be to meaningfully search this area. In 1990, a local true crime show produced a televised reenactment of the disappearance for local broadcast. The broadcast brought in numerous tips, and public interest in the case ended up allowing the family to fundraise a modest reward for information leading to the Jack family. But unfortunately, despite this attention and the monetary reward, none of this brought the family home, or came any closer to solving the cold case. Which brings us back to that Sunday morning in January 1996. That call to the Vanderhoof detachment lasted about 10 seconds with the Jack family, buried at the south end of a ranch, and the ranch's name lost. Police traced it to a house in Stony Creek, a community of the Saikous First Nation just south of Vanderhoof, about an hour west of Prince George. And here the best lead in the case curdled into something maddening. A party at that house had run through the night and was reportedly still going that morning. Somewhere around 10 people had passed through it, and investigators were never able to establish which of them was standing at the phone at 8:33 that night. The call had come from a known house on a known morning, with a short list of possible callers, and the trail still went nowhere. Someone in that house believed he knew where 4 missing people were buried, and he knew it with specificity, the south end of a particular ranch. The Mounties eventually played the tape publicly, hoping a relative or a co-worker somewhere would recognize the voice. They appealed more than once over the years for the caller to reach out again, but he never has. Whether this caller actually knew something, was just repeating a rumor that he had heard, or whether it was something else entirely, nobody actually knows. Then, in 2018, as the anniversary rolled around again, investigators acknowledged that new information about the case had reached them in an unusual way. Someone had contacted a third party by phone and by mail, and that material had eventually been passed along to the cold case file. Police wouldn't say when it had arrived or what it contained, only that it existed and that it was important. A police spokesman eventually came out and said that the file was thousands of documents, but none of them produced the break that the family was hoping for. Personally, I have to question what these documents could have been, though given that there were thousands, I have a theory. I think these documents could have been some sort of employment records for a logging camp that could have met the description of where the family was allegedly taken. That said, I do have to admit here that I'm engaging in speculation, but I do believe there's some evidence in favor of this. The way in which the materials were handed over suggests that it was perhaps an anonymous leak of confidential documents. For instance, maybe it was a human resources person who didn't want to go to detectives directly with the records. I also think the sheer size of the file indicates that it was something from an employer, since employment generates a substantial amount of paperwork. In August 2019, 30 years after the disappearance, searchers brought ground-penetrating radar and heavy equipment onto a rural property on Saiku's territory south of Vanderhoof. This is the same stretch of vast, largely empty country the 1996 call had come from. Whatever information prompted that search, it was specific enough to justify digging, but they found no remains. Whether this was at all related to the documents the police received in 2018 remains unclear. The following year, the case acquired a new set of faces, so to speak. A forensic artist with the Miami-Dade police in Florida produced age progression portraits of the family, including Russell and Ryan as the grown men they would now be. Marlene, Doreen's sister, said that seeing the boys that way was impressive and heartbreaking at once, and as the images circulated online, a fresh wave of tips followed. Her hope, she has said, was never about punishment for the perpetrator. It's about bringing her family home, in whatever capacity. Today, the file sits with the Serious Crimes Unit of the Prince George Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which still keeps an investigator assigned to it. Tips continue to arrive, and each one gets cross-checked against the original material, though many turn out to be things investigators ran to ground decades ago. So with all that said, I want to take a moment to speak about the theories circulating around the disappearance of the Jack family. The first is an accident, which was the initial theory of detectives and which I already briefly discussed. Under that framework, the truck went off a bush road into wetland or a lake, and everyone aboard perished, the driver included. It's the gentlest theory of the case and the hardest one to sustain. Extensive searching found no wreck, which isn't the bombshell it seems to be given how much ground there is to cover in the area, but the driver had a life somewhere. A legitimate man with a real job on offer would have been missed by somebody, and no missing man matching that towering description was ever reported. Even if the man was employed by a lumber camp that thought he simply ghosted them, someone would have recognized his description in the decades since. Another theory is that the job was real but off the books, an unlicensed operation deep in the bush, and something went wrong out there, a dispute or an accident somebody chose to hide. In that version, a family of 4 witnesses became a liability to men who had every reason to stay under the radar. No evidence of any such operation has ever surfaced, which is either the theory's fatal weakness or exactly what you'd expect, depending on where you stand. One darker possibility is that the promised logging camp was never a logging camp at all, but a cover for a guerrilla grow-op hidden deep in the bush. In the late 1980s, remote areas around Prince George offered what an illegal grower would want: There were vast forests, abandoned logging roads, little traffic, and places where a camp could exist without attracting attention. British Columbia was, at the time, one of the centers of the world for grow ops, with the United States being the major target for export. In fact, British Columbia became so associated with weed that the term BC Bud became something close to a brand name in the 1990s. A man recruiting Ronnie to process logs may have been looking for labor without explaining the true nature of the work until the family was already isolated. Under this theory, the offer to employ Doreen and provide daycare was simply bait designed to persuade the family to come willingly. Once they arrived, they may have discovered the criminal activity, a dispute may have arose, and they may have become witnesses who couldn't be allowed to leave. The 1996 caller's claim that the family was buried near a ranch could also fit a rural criminal operation using private land as a base. The weakness is that no evidence has ever publicly connected the Jacks to a grow-op. Still, the anonymous recruiter and the remote destination make an illegal bush operation a plausible, if unproven, possible explanation. Then there's the darkest theory of all, that there was never a camp at all, and the job offer was bait, a way to get a struggling family into a truck willingly. Those who lean toward this version point out how well the lure was built. It explained the remote destination, and it guaranteed that nobody would raise an alarm for 2 full weeks. A job offer accomplished what no abduction could have, which was to make a family of 4 pack its own bags for what amounted to a mostly unknown destination. All that said, nobody has ever been arrested in connection with the disappearance, and nobody has ever been publicly named as a suspect. What really gets to me about this case is how little Ronnie and Doreen were asking for. They weren't chasing some fantasy where the offer had a whole bunch of red flags waving in their face. They were broke, Ronnie needed work, and a stranger offered them something that sounded completely normal for northern British Columbia in 1989. Whoever this man was, he may have understood exactly how vulnerable they were. He didn't need to force them into the truck, at least not directly. All he had to do was offer Ronnie a job, include Doreen, and promise that there were accommodations for Russell and Ryan. Then, to compound it all, the system failed the Jack family too, in a major way that may leave this case permanently cold. The investigation started late. The file was mistakenly closed, and their family spent years feeling like nobody cared enough to look properly. I don't know which theory of the case is right, but I think that, with enough attention, the family may finally get some form of justice. Somebody knows more than they've said, and after nearly 4 decades, the Jack family deserves more than theories. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder to turn on all notifications so you know exactly when I drop new content. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the membership if you want to take your support for my channel to the next level. On the morning of Sunday, August 16th, 2015, employees at a funeral home on San Antonio's northwest side unlocked the building and began preparing for the day. In a private visitation room sat a casket that was supposed to hold the body of a 25-year-old woman named Julie Mott, scheduled for cremation the following morning. The casket was completely empty, and no alarm had sounded overnight, and no door or window showed any sign of forcing. Somewhere between Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning, someone had walked into Mission Park Funeral Chapel's north and walked out with Julie's body. Her memorial service, held the previous afternoon, had fallen on what would have been her 26th birthday. Julie Mott didn't have an easy life. She was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at the age of 2. It's a rare genetic disease that clogs the lungs with thick mucus and steadily destroys them. In the early 90s, a diagnosis like hers came with a median life expectancy reaching only into a patient's late 20s. Despite this difficult diagnosis, Julie did her best to live her life to the fullest. At 9, she started horseback riding lessons, and she kept at it for years, competing in horse shows and show jumping events while managing a disease that made breathing difficult. Despite her positive attitude, the unfortunate reality is that the disease caught up with her anyway. On August 8th, 2015, Julie passed away from complications of cystic fibrosis at the age of 25. Her parents, Tim and Charlotte Mott, arranged services through Mission Park, a family-owned funeral business that had operated in San Antonio for over a century. The place was run by its president, Dick Tipps, and his wife Kristen. And no, I assure you that you don't have to rewind to hear that name again. You heard it correctly the first time. The plan for what would happen next was simple and common enough. There would be a visitation, then a memorial service on Saturday, August 15th, and then a cremation on Monday morning. The Saturday service ended around 1:30 in the afternoon. Afterward, staff moved Julie's casket into a private visitation suite where it sat waiting for Monday's cremation. According to the funeral home, reaching that suite from outside required passing through 2 locked doors. Staff locked the building at roughly 4:30 p.m. and went home for the weekend, and what happened next has never been reconstructed with any degree of confidence. When employees returned Sunday morning, they found the casket empty, and Julie's family soon learned that the body they'd said goodbye to a day earlier had vanished. Investigators quickly ruled out a paperwork mix-up or an early transfer to the crematory. Police opened a case for the theft of her corpse, which under Texas law is a Class A misdemeanor. The physical evidence was thin, and there was no forced entry and no triggered alarm. This meant the person responsible either had keys or knowledge of the building, or had slipped inside before the doors were locked and simply waited. Early reporting suggested investigators initially focused on the 3-hour window between the end of the service and closing time, when the building was still technically open. Whoever did it also managed the practical problem that makes this crime so unusual, because carrying a body out of a building isn't exactly subtle. It takes serious strength and almost certainly a nearby vehicle, yet nobody reported seeing anything. Mission Park offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of Julie's remains, and detectives asked the public for anything at all, no matter how small. Dick Tipps told reporters that his family had been burying San Antonio's dead for 5 generations, and that in all that time the business had never lost a body. He sounded, in those early interviews, like a man who couldn't believe the words coming out of his own mouth. He floated his own theories publicly, suggesting the culprit might have been someone who objected to cremation on principle. That theory wasn't pulled from thin air, and this is where the case turns from strange to unsettling. There was a man in Julie's life who had reportedly objected to her cremation, and investigators were looking at him within days. Police documents from the investigation describe a man in his 20s who had been obsessed with Julie, calling and texting her persistently even as her health failed. He attended the Saturday memorial service, and according to those documents, he was reportedly the last person to leave the building. Julie's father would later say that he'd been uneasy enough about the man's presence at the service that he asked others to keep an eye on him. Police never named him publicly in those first weeks, but his identity eventually became one of the worst-kept secrets in San Antonio. He was Bill Wilburn, Julie's ex-boyfriend, and their relationship would later be described in court as rocky. After the body disappeared, his behavior did him no favors, and weeks into the investigation, Mission Park issued him a formal criminal trespass warning, barring him from the property. He reportedly called the funeral home relentlessly, by some accounts more than 200 times in a single day. In late June 2016, surveillance cameras twice recorded him trying to enter Mission Park North despite the ban. During the first attempt, he left quickly after 3 witnesses recognized him. In February 2017, he was arrested on 2 counts of criminal trespassing and around the same time, a judge approved a warrant allowing investigators to collect a blood sample. The trespassing case reportedly put him on full house arrest for a stretch, and after this, police said he'd turned up at a hotel across the street from the funeral home. A police spokesman said publicly that Wilburn wasn't being fully forthcoming with investigators. Wilburn, for his part, has always denied taking Julie's body. In a television interview in early 2018, he acknowledged driving past the funeral home and deliberately making himself visible there. He compared it to a grieving relative circling the house of the drunk driver who took someone they loved. In his telling, the funeral home was the guilty party, not the scene of his own crime, and he called himself a convenient scapegoat. Now, there are some details that keep this case in the unresolved column rather than merely unprosecuted. Through a decade of scrutiny, searches, and surveillance, police have never found a single piece of physical evidence connecting him to the theft. He has been called a person of interest, never a suspect, and he has never been charged with anything beyond trespassing. With the criminal investigation stalled, the fight moved to civil court. In January 2016, Tim and Charlotte Mott sued Mission Park and the Tips family, alleging negligence in securing their daughter's remains. The family initially sought just over $1 million in damages, though by the time the case reached a jury, their attorneys were asking for as much as $25 million. The trial that opened on January 30th, 2018, became a 2-week airing of everything the public hadn't known about how the funeral home operated. Mission Park's defense pointed squarely at Wilburn, laying out his history with Julie and his behavior after her death. He argued that no security system can fully account for an obsessed individual, and that failure in and of itself isn't negligence. Now, ultimately, I find this to be a somewhat odd argument, since at the end of the day, the funeral home either lost Julie's body or let it be stolen, and had no record of it at all. That part just doesn't sit right with me at all, putting everything else aside completely for a moment. The funeral home didn't even have an adequate system set up that would allow them to figure out who had pulled off this disturbing crime. The Mott family's attorneys pointed back at the building itself. Testimony established that an outside mortuary contractor, the company that handled embalming and transport, had unrestricted around-the-clock access to the funeral home. It turned out that people who weren't Mission Park employees could move through the building with no one logging their comings and goings. The family's lawyers even raised suspicions about one of the contractor's employees, pointing to disturbing imagery on his public social media pages. The Mott family's lawyer was ultimately arguing that there was absolutely no vetting done on who had access to the bodies. And after all, when you put your trust in a funeral home, the one thing you can expect, at minimum, is that they will ensure your loved one's earthly remains are safe with them. On February 13th, 2018, the jury rejected the attempt to pin responsibility on Wilburn and found Mission Park negligent. They concluded that lax security had created the conditions that allowed someone to take Julie's body. They awarded her parents $8 million, $4 million to each. Mission Park appealed. The parties settled for undisclosed terms in 2019, and that December the court vacated the original judgment as part of the agreement. The civil system had assigned blame and a dollar figure, but what it couldn't do was answer the only question the Motts actually cared about. The criminal case has never closed, and it has never really moved, and no one has ever been charged with taking Julie Mott's body or named as a suspect. And this is where I think the case becomes more complicated than it first appears. Bill Wilburn is obviously the person you look at first, since he had a turbulent history with Julie, and his behavior seems to suggest some sort of ongoing mental disturbance. He was opposed to her cremation, attended the memorial, may have been the last mourner to leave, and then behaved in ways afterward that were, at minimum, deeply strange. If you were writing this as fiction, he would almost be too obvious a candidate, but being obvious isn't the same thing as guilty. The problem with the case against Wilburn is that, after more than a decade, there's still no physical evidence showing that he actually removed Julie's body from that funeral home. No witness saw him carrying anything out, and no forensic evidence has tied him to the crime. No trace of Julie's remains were ever found anywhere, let alone somewhere connected to him. And this is important due to how closely watched he was. Police obtained his genetic evidence, watched him, investigated him, and publicly complained that he wasn't being forthcoming, yet they still never charged him with the theft. There was even a civil trial on the matter which found insufficient evidence to find that he was involved on a balance of probabilities. That's a much less stringent legal test than the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, which strongly suggests there wouldn't be enough to successfully prosecute. There's another possibility that I think deserves more attention, since it's clear the funeral home was apparently far less secure than the public initially understood. Outside contractors had 24-hour access, and their movements weren't tracked in any meaningful way. People familiar with the building could potentially come and go without attracting attention. If Julie's body disappeared after closing, the perpetrator may not have been someone who hid inside at all. It could have been someone who already possessed legitimate access and knew exactly how to move through the building without triggering an alarm. That would also help explain one of the strangest aspects of the case: how somebody transported an adult human body through a supposedly secured funeral home without being seen. Wilburn's bizarre conduct may have made him the perfect person to focus on, but it may also have distracted everyone from the real culprit. There is also the potential that there was no crime committed here at all, and that what we ultimately have is a funeral home that inadvertently lost Julie's body. Some have suggested that the civil trial showed that the funeral home really wasn't running the tightest ship. That said, I have trouble believing this, because ultimately, if this did happen, I would have expected someone to come forward when the case went public. Whatever the case, my only hope is that Julie's family can have some closure on this matter after more than a decade of uncertainty.